Afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Amira, for that introduction. First, I'm really delighted to welcome Ramon, who's the IPCC Vice Chair, who's joining us on this session. Ramon leads the Indigenous Partnerships and Relationships file within the IPCC. I think he's going to be joining us, and he'll just give a wave, and he's going to be listening in and taking note of all your questions and interventions. I'm also really delighted to welcome our partners for this session, the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Assembly of First Nations. Both the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Assembly of First Nations are IPCC official observer organizations. And I'd like to invite both organizations to offer a few words of welcome and also to comment on their role within the IPCC. First, Kata, on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, over to you.
Good day, everybody. And I just want to acknowledge also that Ramon has entered into the video space. So hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. And thank you as well for coordinating. My name is Kata Kunert. I'm the Climate Change Policy Advisor at the Inuit Circumpolar Council. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is an international Indigenous peoples organization representing about 180,000 Inuit living in Alaska, Canada, Kishlalit Nunat, Greenland, and Chukotka. Inuit are one people with a homeland spread across 4 countries. And the Inuit Circumpolar Council works to represent the interests of Inuit, including uplifting Inuit knowledge and Inuit rights within all international fora that affects Inuit. So with a special focus on the Arctic region, and also with an interest in bringing the knowledge of Inuit from the Arctic to the world. Until the last IPCC meeting, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has been the first and only Indigenous peoples organization officially accredited observer status at the IPCC. The Inuit Circumpolar Council was accredited in 2021 and has been working in that forum to uplift Inuit knowledge and Inuit rights, as well as in more broader terms, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights, and including galvanizing support for other Indigenous peoples organizations to be joining the IPCC forum. And we were very happy that the Assembly of First Nations was accredited as an observer organization in the last IPCC meeting, and looking forward to seeing the effect of having more Indigenous peoples in the room and bringing to the IPCC the importance of ethically and equitably upholding the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, including one of the things that Inuit Circumpolar Council has been working towards is a long-term accountability mechanism like an Indigenous Peoples Task Force or advisory body for a longer-term involvement and a more fuller, more meaningful, and more effective representation and participation of Indigenous peoples within this body. We also would like to see things in the text that respect the inherent rights of Indigenous people as reflected in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and a greater reflection of the Arctic as a sensitive region. And so Inuit have been participating in this space, including as expert reviewers, as contributing authors for the special report on oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. In previous assessment cycles, when there have been polar regions chapters, Inuit and the Inuit Circumpolar Council have been participating in those spaces and working to shift both the representation within the text, the way that Indigenous knowledge is portrayed, to ensure that it is considered at an equal level to academic science, and to making sure there's a more fuller participation within the space. So those are some of the pieces from the Inuit Circumpolar Council side, both from participating in the meetings, providing comments to the text, contributing to the text, and then participating in the way that the science and the politic are determined or discussed within some of the negotiations. So happy to be here today. Looking forward to hearing from our different speakers and really hoping that there will be a lot of people put their name forward for Indigenous authorship so that the IPCC can see just how much expertise there are within Indigenous communities. And we're looking for a greater representation of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges within the 7th assessment cycle, including a very fulsome discussion at the workshop on engaging diverse knowledge systems, which has a thematic focus on Indigenous knowledge, and hoping that there are some longer term outcomes that come from that opportunity for Indigenous expertise to be represented and considered within its own, for Indigenous knowledge to be considered within its own frame of reference that uplifts its own expertise within this process. So I'll pass it back to Sherry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kata, and yeah, thank you to the Inuit Circumpolar Council. They have been doing such a really good job and playing a really important role in pushing the IPCC to improve its engagement with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems through the cycle. Ramon, welcome. It's good to see your face, and thank you so much for joining us. And Graham, I'd like to turn it over to you now on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations.
Yeah, Miigwech, Bojo, Graham Reed, Nidishkas, Arononchva, Anishinaabe, and Dow. It's a real honor to join this space with all of you. I'm joining from unceded and surrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe, what's currently known as Ottawa. My dad's side is English and Scottish, and mom's is German and Anishinaabe. My great grandfather was born in Wakomokong, and yeah, very happy to join these welcoming words from the perspective of the Assembly of First Nations, the second accredited Indigenous organization within the IPCC. And for everybody interested, this is a relatively straightforward process if you're already accredited within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so I think part of our aspirations here are how do we increase the engagement with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems, but also how do we create space for more observer organizations to participate meaningfully in this process. For those who don't know, the Assembly of First Nations is a national advocacy body for First Nations across what's currently known as Canada. There are 634 First Nations across the country, just under 1 million people, and have been implicated in the ongoing advocacy for First Nations inclusion within national and international climate discussions for a long time, and have had the privilege of participating within the IPCC in different capacities, but now in a more official capacity through our own respective observer organization. The mandate and direction that we receive from 2 assemblies a year, so that's the summer and winter, was to advocate for the declaration of a First Nations climate emergency. And recently we reaffirmed that declaration of a First Nations climate emergency and have adopted the AFN National Climate Strategy as a document of advocacy for all of our respective engagements within different spaces on climate change. And really the intention there is to say, how do we conceptualize and think about climate change from the perspective of First Nations? How do we do that in a way that really shifts it on the root causes driving what is occurring within these intertwined systems that are resulting in the polycrisis that we're facing currently? And how do we then advocate for those knowledge systems to transform global discussions on conceptualizing the problem and conceptualizing the solution? And so that national climate strategy is really the place in which we're entering the IPCC. How are we creating space, as Kata shared, for the ethical and equitable engagement of First Nations knowledge systems? How do we do that also through interrogating some of the institutional biases contained within the IPCC and the way in which research is conceptualized and thought about in the different ways that are being communicated? How do we ensure that a coalition of Indigenous peoples can participate and create space within these international organizations, and ultimately differentiate the predominant approach of forcing Indigenous peoples, their rights, knowledge systems, and governance into non-Indigenous processes. And so really, this session here is the start of that process. Long-term institutional change takes a long time, but what are the ways in which that we can envision the IPCC as an institution that is fit for purpose, an institution that advances just, equitable, decolonial, and resilient visions for our future, a future that is based on the balance of humans and our more than human relatives. And so what are the ways in which that we can do that through creating more space and engagement with Indigenous peoples? And I think that's really what we're excited to do with all of you today. So miigwech, and yeah, I really look forward to the different discussions that we'll have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for co-hosting this session with us. And it's so inspiring to hear both of you talk about ways that the IPCC can improve and how it needs to evolve and change, and your calls also for more Indigenous observer organizations to join, and your calls for the creation of some sort of Indigenous caucus or Indigenous task group within the IPCC. So with that, we'll move to our next agenda item for today's meeting. I'd like to give a little bit of a background on the IPCC, and also a snapshot or a sneak peek at AR7. So I'm going to try and share my slides here. And Graham, Kato, Ramon, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see this screen? Okay, perfect. Okay, wonderful. So the IPCC is an organization that sits under the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Organization, and its role is to assess the science of climate change. And so we do these climate change assessments through different cycles. And although it's a scientific assessment, it does have really important connections with the UNFCCC, and it has, helped inform the development of the things like the Paris Agreement. So far, we've completed 6 different assessment cycles, and we're currently in the 7th assessment cycle. Each assessment cycle has a number of different steps, 10 main steps, from scoping and creating an outline to the publication of reports. One of the steps that is a unique feature of the IPCC is that it undergoes a line-by-line approval session for the summary for policymakers. So the summary for policymakers is approved by the 195 member states or countries that are involved with the IPCC. And when they approve the SPM, that means that they're approving or adopting, accepting the final report. In the 7th assessment cycle, we've finished the scoping. So we've met with experts from around the world to create this outline. And then the outline was agreed to by different member states and governments. And now we're in step 3, where we're looking for authors to be nominated to be included in the AR7 reports. There's other different products of this 7th assessment cycle, including a special report on cities, which we've already selected the lead authors for, and they've already had their first lead author meeting, and they're getting ready for their second lead author meeting. And now, right now, today, especially, we're talking about the 7th assessment report for Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. But there are other really important things that we do along the way. And 2 that I wanted to highlight here, the governments have agreed to have an expert workshop on Indigenous knowledge systems. And there's also going to be an expert meeting on gender and inclusivity. The dates of these have not been set yet, but we're hoping that they'll happen in the Northern Hemisphere fall. So maybe sometime in October this year, tentatively. So within the IPCC, there are these 3 different working groups, Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. So Working Group 1 focuses on the physical basis of climate change, or how the climate has changed and how it will continue to change into the future. Working group 2 focuses on impacts and adaptation, so how those changes impact the environment and how they impact society and what things we can do to adapt to some of those changes. And working group 3 focuses on mitigation, or how we can prevent further climate change from happening. And so right now we're recruiting authors for these different working group reports. The approved outlines sort of look like this. I'm going to give a very high level overview because these approved outlines are online, and we will provide links in the chat so you can access these approved outlines. So for working group 1, which focuses on how the climate has changed and how it will change in the future, there are 3 sort of different parts to the chapter structure. The first 3 chapters, chapter 2, 3, 4, focus on current status and trends of the climate systems. Chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 look at how things could change into the future. And chapters 9 and 10 and the interactive atlas provide information for responses. Another way that you could look at the narrative for the chapter, for the working group 1 structure is 2 different scales. So chapters 2, 2, and 6 look at global and large scale changes, and chapters 3 and 7 are really looking at different regional changes. So that's the working group 1 structure of the approved outline. And working group 2, which is then taking how the climate has changed and how it will continue to change into the future, and look at how those changes will have impacts on the environment and society. And so this is a schematic that working group 2 has illustrated to sort of, I guess, illustrate how the chapters will be broken down. There's different sections, and the first section is sort of like global assessment chapters. That includes assessment of vulnerabilities, impacts, and risks, different chapters on adaptation, a chapter on responses to losses and damages, and a chapter on finance. The next section of chapters are regional assessment chapters. So all of the different IPCC regions have a specific chapter. Then there are thematic assessment chapters. So those include things like climate change impacts and adaptation for different terrestrial, freshwater, and cryosphere ecosystems and their services, as well as things like water, agriculture, adaptation of human settlements, health and well-being, poverty, livelihoods, mobility, and fragility. And then in this assessment cycle, there'll also be an overview of the technical guidelines on impacts and adaptation. So these are the different places where you could apply to be a coordinating lead author or lead author for working group 2. Working group 3, which is focusing on mitigation and how we can prevent the climate from changing in the future, has 15 different chapters. And a way to think about the storyline of Working Group 3's report is that the first sort of block of chapters, chapters 2, 3, and 4, focus on past and current trends and future sustainable development and mitigation. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 look at factors that enable or constrain mitigation. Chapters 8 to 14 are different sector systems and their integration. And chapter 15 focuses on carbon dioxide removal. But what's really important to highlight is that across all of these reports, and I would argue across all of the different chapters, the inclusion of Indigenous content and Indigenous knowledge systems is really essential in all 3 of the working group reports and in all of the chapters. So we really do encourage anyone who's an Indigenous knowledge holder, especially, or works in this space, to consider applying to be an author. And so there's different ways to get involved. And you're going to hear others speak about this in detail, and we'll circle back to this at the end about how to apply. But the first way you can become involved in IPCC is to contribute to existing literature. And this includes both peer-reviewed literature or gray literature. So if the IPCC's job is to assess the state of knowledge on climate change, then contributing to that knowledge base is one way to contribute. Another way to contribute is as an expert reviewer. So there are two open calls where anyone who has expertise or knowledge on climate change around the world can be an expert reviewer. And those review comments really do shape the content of the report. I was a lead author in the 6th assessment cycle, and I have to say that these review comments are absolutely critical, and they really do matter, and they really do shape the reports. And the last way to be involved that I wanted to mention right now was to apply to be an author or a review editor. So, and that's the process that we'll speak a little bit more about later today. So that's my short introduction to the AR7 process. We're going to have some more speakers join us and give some reflections. And then at the end, we'll also include an overview of how to apply. So we're also going to hold questions until the end of the session. So please do bring your questions or comments. Make sure you note those down. We really want to hear from you. So jot down any comments or questions that you might have, or you can put them into the Q&A box. But rest assured, we will have a Q&A period at the end of the session. So now for the next part of this session, we wanted to reflect on the IPCC processes. We first wanted to look back on the last assessment cycle to identify areas of progress, but also to identify gaps and limitations. Then we want to look forward to the AR7 process and explore opportunities and envision how we can meaningfully and ethically advance Indigenous inclusion in the reports. So we're going to start by looking back to AR6. So to do this, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosa Carmona. Rosa has led an analysis of Indigenous inclusion in the IPCC AR6 assessment, and she's going to share her results and insights from this analysis that she did. Rosa, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm delighted to turn the floor over to you now.
Thank you so much, Shirley. I'm going to share my screen and give me 1 second. Okay, so can you see it?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. Well, thank you again. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'd like to present today is the analysis that Graham, our co-authors, and I conducted on the inclusion and consideration of Indigenous peoples' knowledges and participation in the 6th IPCC assessment cycle. Our analysis focused especially on mentions of the term indigenous that clearly refer to Indigenous peoples. These references have grown considerably. However, this increase is not consistent across the different working groups or even across chapters within the same reports. In Working Group 1, which focused on the physical science of climate change, the references to Indigenous peoples remain very limited. Still, compared to previous report, there is a noticeable increase. The main message here is the recognition that Indigenous knowledges can complement non-Indigenous science, but integration remains a challenge. Integration is the word that IPCC used. However, this framing tends to position Indigenous knowledges as subordinate, mainly as a supporting or validating resource for Western or non-Indigenous science, rather than as a knowledge system of right holders. This reflects a fairly apolitical approach to inequality and vulnerability, treating these as naturalized conditions. And here I want to share a personal experience as a contributing author to this working group. It was very disappointing to see a statement claiming that Indigenous knowledges are being lost primarily because knowledge holders are passing away, which reduces the problem to a kind of democratic issue without addressing the systemic causes of knowledge erosion, such as colonialism and marginalization, and also climate change. In contrast, Working Group 2, which addresses impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, includes over 1,000 references to Indigenous peoples. It strongly emphasizes the relevance of Indigenous knowledges in responding to climate change and calls for the integration of Indigenous and scientific knowledge systems. It also highlights the importance of Indigenous peoples' participation in climate governance, recognizing their knowledge contribution to resilience, risk reduction, adaptation, climate justice, policymaking, and sustainable food and water systems. It also recognized not only the impacts of climate change, but the impacts caused by maladaptation and what we can call false solutions, and very crucially, acknowledges colonialism for the first time as a driver of vulnerability. Working Group 3, which focuses on mitigation, contains a more moderate number of references. It emphasizes the role of Indigenous peoples in sustainable land management and their contributions to mitigation. It also notes the need for participatory strategies and recognizes the transformative potential of Indigenous knowledges. This last point is particularly relevant given that Working Group 3 has often been associated with promoting market-based solutions that can perpetuate the same structural problems, such as carbon markets. So this shift toward transformative change is, although brief, a notable inclusion. And finally, the synthesis report includes 24 references to Indigenous peoples. This reinforced the finding of Working Group 2 regarding colonialism, maladaptation, and participation. Despite this progress, we believe significant limitations remain. There is still a lack of ethical, right-based, or deeply engaged approaches to Indigenous knowledges. Representation of Indigenous peoples is inconsistent across the working groups, reflecting a lack of consensus within the IPCC itself on how to meaningfully engage Indigenous peoples and their knowledges. There is also a tendency to homogenize Indigenous peoples, treating them as a single, undifferentiated group without acknowledging specific nations, territories, cultures, or values. There is very little attention to intersectionality among Indigenous peoples themselves as well. Furthermore, while colonialism is acknowledged, Indigenous peoples continue to be framed primarily as vulnerable rather than as agents of change. Their knowledges are often simplified or misunderstood and not treated as complex living systems. They are often conflated with local knowledge, overlooking the deep relationship between Indigenous peoples, their territories, and their inherent rights. The reports also fail to explain how Indigenous knowledge holders were involved in the process. There is no discussion of co-production of knowledge between Indigenous contributions and lead authors. And we believe this is largely due to the lack of Indigenous authors, particularly coordinating lead authors and lead authors, but also the limited influence sometimes of contributing authors who often have very little opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue or propose changes within the drafting process. Although the benefits of collaboration are mentioned, very few concrete examples are provided. And I know that a DOC working group was created to improve the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges, but we didn't find any reference to this working group in the report itself. And the reports offer little evidence of partnership between Indigenous knowledge holders and non-Indigenous scientists, and they also fail to reflect the growing body of Indigenous-led research. All of this evidences that structural limitation of the IPCC as a body that primarily reviews scientific literature and does not engage directly with knowledge holders or other means of assessment. From this analysis, we proposed a series of recommendations aimed at strengthening the participation and leadership of Indigenous peoples in the AR7 cycle, ideally starting from the scoping process. And the question I would like to leave you with is, will the creation of a task force on Indigenous knowledge systems, for example, like the one established under IPCC, help advance a rights-based approach to engagement? And I know this is a broader topic that deserves its own space, but I believe that the key point to consider is that any body created for this purpose must have a binding mandate. It should facilitate direct engagement with CLA and LAs and not be structured as a parallel space reserved only for Indigenous peoples, whose outputs are considered only as recommendations. And this question is not only important for understanding how Indigenous peoples can influence the IPCC, but also for improving how the information presented in AR7 can be accessible and truly helpful and meaningful for Indigenous peoples themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa, for those insights and really important comments about the AR6 process. So let's continue to reflect back on the AR6 cycle with Dr. Pasang Sherpa. Dr. Pasang Sherpa is an assistant professor of Lifeways in Indigenous Asia at the University of British Columbia. She was a contributing author to the AR6 Working Group 2 report and also to the special report on oceans and cryosphere and a changing climate. She co-founded the Indigenous Justice and analyzed the IPCC AR6 products for Indigenous inclusion, including an analysis of the literature that's been cited in Working Group 1, 2, and 3 of the 6th assessment cycle. Pasang, over to you to continue our reflection back on the AR6 process.
Thank you, Sherry, for that interview, and also thank you, Rosa, Dr. Carmona, for that excellent presentation. I think it leads us well into what I'll be talking about. I'm Pasang Yangji Sherpa Tashsile. I'm currently speaking from Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people territory, and which is where the University of British Columbia is. But I am from Farak, southern part of Khumbu. Many people know it as the Mount Everest region in Nepal. What you're seeing here, this is Kumbiyula, the protected deity of our region, and I begin this presentation with reference to Kumbila. So, for the presentation itself, I have 10 minutes, so I'll try to keep the first introduction quite brief because I want to go into the findings. I won't be able to share a lot today, but I will give some insights and highlights from the work we have done, and finally offer some conclusion. So as Sherry already mentioned, I was a contributing author to 2 different chapters, 2 different reports in the AR6 process. And based on that experience, my colleague, Dr. Ritodi Chakravarti, who will be speaking next, we were critically reflecting on our experience and trying to understand how Indigenous content or Indigenous inclusion in the IPCC processes actually happen after we participated in the AR6 process. And it is around this time, like around 2022, when our colleague, Doctors Mabel Gergen and Costanza Rampini were also involved in the initial conversation. But what really led to the Knowledge Justice Collective is the encouragement from our United Nations Foundation colleague, UNF colleague, Christine Ostenik. And so basically, as a collective, we seek to respectfully advance meaningful engagements across knowledge systems. And this begins with the recognition of epistemological value of Indigenous knowledges in solving world problems. So some of our initial thoughts and reflections have already been published and quite used widely by others. But one of the first things we did was at the COP27 in Egypt, we organized this conversation, a panel at the US Center with support from UNF, which Sherry was part of, obviously. But in any case, some of our findings after we completed our research on the systematic review of the IPCC AR6, we shared our findings publicly for the first time at the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion at the COP29 in Baku last November. So with this background, I'll go directly into the work. So studying Indigenous content in the AR5 and AR6, I identified 3 different research clusters. Assuming that all of the research and all of the first cluster, for example, there's a lot of people who have been involved and a lot of people who have subsequently produced publications, but I recognize them as the first cluster. That included The first cluster reviewed the inclusion of Indigenous content in AR5 Working Group 2. So a lot of the work has come out of it. And the second cluster, I consider Rosa, Dr. Carmano's team, including Graham Reed, who was part of that process of reviewing the AR6. So the second cluster reviewed the recognition of Indigenous peoples in the AR6, drawing upon the experience of some of the co-authors who are contributing authors to AR6 Working Group 1 and 2, and observers of the IPCC as members of government delegation in the approval plenaries of the Working Group 1, 2, and 3. And thirdly, I consider the Knowledge Justice Collective as the third cluster. So our review consisted of two parts. The first reviewed all mentions of the terms of any mention of Indigenous we included in our review, and any mentions of local we also included. And in this case, instead of only focusing on one, we decided to focus on all Working Group 1, 2, and 3 in an attempt to understand the inclusion of Indigenous content. And unlike the first two clusters, we expanded the search to include local because the IPCC processes in the AR6 were using the IPLC, Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities, as a framework in its assessment cycle. And also because the scientific literature AR6 relied upon used the terms Indigenous and local interchangeably. So if we really wanted to understand inclusion of Indigenous content, it was important that we also think about local in this sense. Furthermore, we did so in consideration of the reality that not all member governments recognize Indigenous peoples in their countries, and as such, local stands as a surrogate term. And I should note here that Indigenous peoples globally have strongly continued to argue against the use of local to refer to them, as it problematically puts Indigenous and settler communities in the same category, being one of the many reasons. But in this part of my presentation, so I want to make sure that I'm quite clear that I'm actually referring to the use of local in the scientific literature, and which is the IPCC knowledge base that Sherry was also mentioning earlier. When this happens, the IPCC knowledge base itself is propagating problematic representation of Indigenous peoples and their knowledges, which need to be considered. Secondly, this is also to talk about the second part of our review, which focused on references cited in the AR6, and there are around 80,000 plus references in all three reports together. So with support from geographer Eric Nost and student assistant Declan Taylor, we reviewed the references, and the second part of was especially useful in better understanding the landscape of climate knowledge production the AR7 is going to rely upon. So there are three key insights here. First, the knowledge, firstly, close attention should be paid to who the lead authors for each of the chapters in the ARs really are. And I want to emphasize this point because there are so many different ways to be involved as Indigenous authors, reviewers, or participants and observers as participants in the IPCC processes. But what really comes down to, in my perspective personally, is the fact that we need more Indigenous lead authors to determine the extent of meaningful inclusion of Indigenous content and also who gets cited in the chapters, because we know from experience that's what happens. So similar to Rosa, who presented earlier, we also found Indigenous references across the Working Group 2 chapters, but our two-part review showed that the citation levels varied across the chapters. So even though we see Working Group 2 as this report that really did well in terms of including Indigenous content, we know that it was not the same or uniform across the chapters. So whereas Chapter 4 has the greatest number of references to literature whereas Okay, whereas chapter 4 has the greatest number of references to literature with Indigenous content, it's actually chapter 14 and 18 arguably have had the most impact on centering Indigenous perspectives, voices, and experiences in the Working Group 2 report. And this is again referencing to what Rosa shared earlier, the use of the word colonialism in this context also happens in these chapters, in chapter 14. So secondly, the IPCC structure that includes the Bureau and their selection of the experts, as well as the knowledge outputs, is limited in what they can achieve for meaningful inclusion of Indigenous peoples globally. And I say this, the institutional structure and the internal mechanisms of the IPCC by design marginalizes Indigenous peoples at present. So here, Euro-Western climate science is centered, and the authority to approve the AR6 lies with the member government. And this is what I'm referring to. So therefore, an over-reliance on the ARs for climate science with direct implications for Indigenous lived realities really need to also be reassessed. And so now I'm speaking to Indigenous peoples in the room and Indigenous and people who work on Indigenous issues. So thirdly, the IPCC's approach to indigeneity is based on existing literature produced in the global north and largely from climate change research that have been found to access Indigenous people's knowledge in extractive ways, thus paying attention solely on numerical increases of Indigenous content, which is how other studies have studied Indigenous inclusion. So relying solely on that method rather than the uneven Indigenous representation in the IPCC knowledge base produced in the English language by researchers largely in environmental science related disciplines. So that's what our data shows. So most of the authors are English language speaking researchers publishing in global north context and largely from environmental science related disciplines at elite institutions. So all of this limit our understanding of the nuances of Indigenous content in the ARs. So I know I'm already at 11 minutes, but this is to highlight all of these insights, highlight the conditions in which we are informing and encouraging Indigenous peoples to engage with the IPCC today. So this is not to discourage people from engaging with the IPCC, but understanding the context in which we are participating or hoping to participate, and the kinds of places where interventions will be necessary. Indigenous scholars and Indigenous people's engagement with the IPCC, however, should not come at the expense of their own assessments for the well-being of their people. So I personally see the IPCC as an additional tool and a useful tool. And for many people, maybe the only, and for many Indigenous people, especially in the Global South context, the only assessment tool that they might have. So the IPCC process itself is very important. But finally, since I don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to quickly come to the Himalayas. So the Himalayas, in the Himalayas, there's no lack of international peer-reviewed, academically produced papers involving Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' knowledge, which is going to meet the IPCC knowledge-based requirements. So it is very likely that the AR7 will find a rich pool of literature from the Himalayas for its Indigenous content if they are uncritically and tokenistically engaged with. So I think this is something looking forward, AR7 should really pay attention to. Using extractive climate change research in the AR7 will magnify, and we know that the knowledge base itself is extractive and problematic. So using that without critically engaging with it will actually magnify the initial harm done to Indigenous peoples by climate change studies due to IPCC's elevated status as the authoritative body that summarizes climate science for the global community. The AR7 should involve a mechanism to identify the types of literature they are relying upon and be transparent about their choices of literature across all chapters of the 3 working group reports. The rationale for choosing the literature needs to be outlined clearly in the main reports, the synthesis reports, and especially in the summaries for policymakers. And without an intervention at the knowledge-based level, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' knowledges will continue to be legible only through extractive relationships in the IPCC AR processes while continuing to promote epistemic Eurocentrism. The Knowledge Justice Collective is currently devising a knowledge justice protocol to test the quality of Indigenous content in each of the chapters in the AR7, which my colleague Dr. Ritodi Chakravarti will speak about. And so I'll not say more. So finally, if we pay attention to the Indigenous climate sciences from communities living with firsthand experience of climate change impacts and the past IPCC ARs, we know that the likelihood of extreme events, extreme weather events, and climate change related natural disasters occurring is very high. In 5 years, when the AR7 comes out, or 4 years now, Indigenous communities from the Himalayas will have experienced more disasters, lost more, and continue to grieve possibly without a respite. So I also ask, what would meaningful inclusion of Indigenous content in the AR7 from the Himalayas and places like it, where extractive climate research is plenty and people's lived realities are rapidly shifting? What would that look like? So with that, I'll just stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sherpa. That was really, really helpful. I think that we have so much still to learn from the AR6 reports, and also to sort of like re-envision what Indigenous participation could look like or mean in the context of the IPCC for AR7. So now that we've reflected back on AR6, let's look forward to AR7. So next, we're going to have Dr. Graham Reed join us, as well as Dr. Ritodi Chakraborty, they're both going to reflect on some opportunities and challenges for AR7. So you've already met Graham earlier in this section. Dr. Graham Reed is a strategic advisor with the Assembly of First Nations. And joining Graham is Dr. Ritodi Chakraborty, who's a lecturer in the Department of Environmental Management at Lincoln University and a co-founder of the Knowledge Justice Collective with Dr. Sherpa. Graham and Ritodi, I'm really happy to turn the floor over to you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Namaskar. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much, Shirley, for the invitation. And it's really wonderful and humbling to be with all of you. Graham, if I may, I think one of the things that really struck me in your conversation that you started with, as well as in Kata's, in Dr. Carmona, as well as Pasang's talk, was one of the things that I feel it has been a struggle within the IPCC for quite some time now, which is we have a higher level aspiration of inclusion, right? And what that looks like, let's say within a political space, right, at a, let's say, national scale, we can kind of talk about legally, we can talk about through executive institutions, but it often becomes more blurry when it enters the scientific space, right? So what I feel is kind of lacking right now is process, right? How do we ensure that some of these things that we are talking about is processually put into place? What that means is, yes, you and I can, talk, and all of us can together talk about what is needed and what is required. But however, if we don't have a process in place, both an enabling process as well as a regulatory process, then we're not going to be able to achieve any change at the material level, right? So I think one of the things that really strikes me is that, I go back to the work that we've done, where out of 41,000 citations, we have 434 that engage with Indigenous knowledge. If anybody's doing the math, that's 0.01%. So let's say on a volumetric scale, Indigenous knowledge for all purposes doesn't really exist within the IPCC R6. On the other hand, we have the kind of provocations presented by that chapter that Pasang referred to on North America, which brings to the surface ideas like colonization, ideas like what are the systemic roots that are driving these forms of exclusion. So one of the ways to think about it is, can we devise a set of protocols at the chapter scale, which will allow for, in some ways, an artificial separation between community, data, and analytics, right? Thinking about these three key pieces in isolation from each other, even though they are deeply entangled, right? But I think what we need, and that's just my opinion, is that we really need Indigenous support and Indigenous inclusion in devising protocols that allow for data justice, plural analytics, and then finally, what we need is sort of like a reformed set of community engagement processes that are throughout the IPCC knowledge production process. And that's just my thoughts. Please go ahead, Graham. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really loved that, and I really loved both Rosa's and Pasang's presentations. It makes me think about three things, and this is maybe what I'll kind of comment on. The first is, like, what are the ways in which the IPCC as a structure is deeply problematic at a procedural and epistemic level. And so we don't even need to get into the space of how it's ethically including Indigenous peoples. We can say generally the institution itself is heavily global North focused. It's heavily male dominated. And like we should really assess what are the implications of that. It upholds understandings of subjectivity and science as, you know, real and truth, without actually critically investigating the way in which that's based on a certain ontological framework. And to all of the points that Pasang raised, it also engages in this notion of like citational politics that heavily relies on the English language, right? Like it's I think it's deeply unfortunate that a global scientific body is so focused on upholding predominantly English-based literature. And so for all those reasons, like that is the way in which that institutionally the IPCC needs to shape itself so that it's not upholding these like very Eurocentric understandings. Then on the basis of that shifting, we can say, like, what are the ethical ways in which the process itself can engage with Indigenous peoples? And I think those elements of just different procedures are really important. Like, what are the ways in which, practically speaking, Indigenous authors are supported? How are they supported in positions of leadership? And Pasang shared the importance of those being in whether it's coordinating lead author, whether it's lead author positions, because a lot of what we're seeing is that when folks don't have the disciplinary expertise to engage in plural knowledge systems or plural epistemologies, they rely on the ones that they know, and that upholds this very hard or natural science driven, and that actually, to all of our points, directly excludes Indigenous peoples who are advancing, you know, distinct and parallel ways in knowing. And so what are the ways in which that those authors are supported effectively? I like the idea of protocol. It's also, whether it's protocol or guidelines, like what are the ways in which we are embedding within every chapter, right? So that we're not relying on individual chapters for knowledge systems to be ethically engaged. What does it mean to create that environment in which these systems of knowledge are engaged ethically? And a lot of that comes back to, like, how are we disclosing our respective positionalities, whether that's ontological or epistemological, which is should not be a threatening process, right? It's like all of us are informed by our experiences, our training, our life experiences, our relationalities. And that's really the core to building ethical and responsible relationships. How do we widen our literature basis, right? Like even the points that Pasang was raising, we're talking about natural science that is written by non-Indigenous peoples. Like what are the ways in which we are empowering Indigenous peoples to communicate their own understandings of their knowledge systems, of the problems that they're facing. And on that basis, and on the work of the Knowledge Justice Collective, how are we building these coalitions to really, what is ultimately within these processes, shift power, right? Like this is the process that straddles the line between science and policy, and ultimately is interwoven within a deeply political space. And so it's also interesting just institutionally how, you know, a lot of different folks who have spent their careers working in the IPCC navigate that relationship to politics, right? That relationship to power, because that also deeply impacts like who is being positioned to contribute, how are they then being represented in the kind of final body, which is a summary for policymakers. And how is that summary for policymakers and the reports themselves actually serving people? And here's what I'll conclude with. And so the third body of what I think we need to consider is like, how do we uplift and support Indigenous peoples in conducting their own assessments based on their understandings, based on their worldviews, and use that as a way in which we're understanding the breadth of issues. And for instance, in the Canadian context, we've done that. We've started to do that, and it's not even close to what it would what it would require through the For Our Future report, which is a report that we produced as part of the national assessment within Canada to articulate like what is the problems and what are the solutions and how do we represent that within the perspective of Indigenous people. So lots of different ways I think that we can do that.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. It's been really helpful to hear about different opportunities, but also challenges as we, you know, look forward to AR7. So in case anyone on the call is interested in engaging in AR7, and I really hope you are interested in engaging in some way and helping us do some of the things that have been highlighted to to do the things that are needed to be done to improve the process. I wanted to walk through some of the ways that you can engage in the process. So this is sort of more of the pragmatic or logistical pieces. So I have a couple of slides. I'm going to share my screen and move forward. So you'll remember this slide that I shared earlier. So you can contribute to existing literature, gray or peer-reviewed. You can contribute as an expert reviewer, or you can apply to be a lead author or contributing lead author, or a lead author or coordinating lead author, or be a contributing author. So this takes a lot of people, and some of these numbers were alluded to before, but just, you know, looking back at the sixth assessment or cycle, looking at the numbers, there were 796 authors, over 100,000 pieces of literature were assessed, and there were over 300,000 reviewer comments to be addressed in the report. So this is a massive undertaking. And I think that there's lots of room to do better in terms of Indigenous engagement within these numbers. So how can you potentially get involved? There are 3 roles that you can apply for: a contributing lead author, a lead author, or a review editor. Through these roles, there are different in-person lead author meetings that you attend. The coordinating lead authors and lead authors invite contributing authors to participate in the assessment and to write some of the text. There are also chapter scientists as well as expert reviewers. So there's lots of different ways to engage. The immediate call right now for authors are for lead authors, contributing lead authors, and review editors, which are on the left side of the screen. But later on in the process, there's opportunity to be engaged as a contributing author or an expert reviewer. A couple of important notes about being a lead author or contributing lead author. Your time is voluntary. All of the IPCC authors are not remunerated for their salary. It's a volunteer position. Some resources can be provided, such as access to scientific journals or literature for the Global South. There are 4 in-person lead author meetings that you're required to go to. The Global South authors, their travel is supported by the IPCC Trust Fund. If you are in the Global North, then usually your country's government will pay for your travel to attend these in-person meetings. So some timelines. The call for nominations went out on March 7th. And you can apply to your focal point or to other people to be a contributing lead author, or review editor by April 17th. Bureau members like Ramon and I can also make nominations. And observer organizations like the Inuit Circumpolar Council or the Assembly of First Nations can also nominate experts. The selection for contributing lead authors, and review editors will happen over the coming months. And we're hoping to make final selections by July or August. So what can you do? Reach out to a potential nominator, reach out to your national focal point, reach out to any of the observer organizations, or reach out to a bureau member to be nominated. Put together your application package. The forms are online and we'll provide links to those in the chat as well. And then submit your nomination. If you want to know where to find your focal point, it is on the IPCC website, and we'll put a link in the chat. You can contact them. A lot of different countries have different processes in terms of how they accept and compile and submit different nominations. Other ways to be nominated, like I mentioned, you can look up any observer organizations. Usually observer organizations also have a process in terms of how they recruit and submit different applications. We'll put a link to the observer organizations in the chat that you can go through, or you can contact a bureau member and ask them to nominate you. If you are an Indigenous knowledge holder or an Indigenous person, I personally would be happy to nominate you if you would rather not go through your country or go through an observer organization. Feel free to reach out to me, and we'll put my email address in the chat. An important tip, after going through the city's report applications, it's really helpful in your application that if you're an Indigenous knowledge holder or an Indigenous person, that you make that really clear in your application form. Make it clear in the Excel file that you have to fill out, and also make it really clear in your CV. Sometimes this information is hard to tell in the application forms, but obviously, as we've heard from the past presenters and speakers, being an Indigenous knowledge holder, an Indigenous person, is really, really important in the process. So yeah, I hope you'll consider applying applications. The nominations period closes April 17th. So with that, I'd like to invite all of our panelists back to the main seminar room. And now we're going to turn it over to all of you. We want to hear your questions and comments. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or raise your hand to ask a question. We really want to hear your comments, your questions. Feel free to ask any of the panelists here. To get us started, I'll go with the first question that I see in the Q&A box, which is, what role does the IPCC leadership expect Indigenous scholars to play in Working Group 1 specifically? So as a Working Group 1 Vice Chair, I can confidently say that we're very, very eager and keen to have Indigenous authors apply to be a CLA or an LA in the process. But I'd like to actually turn over to the panelists to speak to any comments on how Indigenous scholars or Indigenous persons could contribute to Working Group 1. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I can say a couple of things. Working Group 1 is where we need the most Indigenous inclusion, because I would say if we've learned anything from the last 2 cycles, it is that STEM disciplines often I would say, pass the indigeneity or the Indigenous knowledge onto Working Group 2 and 3, almost compartmentalizing that physical science has nothing in common with Indigenous knowledge. And this is a really problematic precedent. And again, it is really kind of shocking that all of the Indigenous knowledge cited in Working Group 1 is less than what was cited in 1 chapter of Working Group 2. So the truth is that a key problem, I would say, for Working Group 1, according to me, is that a lack of process around how you would take, let's say, something like boundary layer dynamics in physics or some kind of a biochemical process and bring that in conversation with Indigenous knowledge. There are ways of doing that. There are people who are doing that. However, those people need to get involved, and that's exactly it. We need epistemic bridges to be built, and we need those bridge builders to be involved in the Working Group 1. I can't stress this enough. Working Group 1 is like the triage site. It's where the most intervention needs to happen.
Thank you. And Graham, I see your mic. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I just want to give like a concrete example to this. And one concrete example is just the way in which the IPCC represents pathways and the shared socioeconomic pathways. There has been no real analysis on what are the assumptions built within the development of these assessment models, and how do those assessment models actually reproduce the sorts of disconnected thinking that we have within the kind of predominant literature basis. And so, you know, one thing that we've done, for instance, in the coming Canada and a Changing Climate report that's coming out in 2026, and for those who are really big policy and research nerds, like there's been a review process, but we've actually built a box, and it's not to the point that is being described, but it is, how do we begin to actually communicate what are the assumptions built within these processes? Because communicating the assumptions built within the process are the prerequisite to then engaging ethically with other knowledge systems. Like, how do we create that space in order to allow a clear articulation of what are the ways in which that these knowledge systems are taken as fact, but in actuality perpetuate certain injustices. And so that's just one example of how it's been done in another place, but completely agree that Working Group 1, I think, is a really important basis for this work.
And I will say too that I think the co-chairs of Working Group 1 are very committed to doing a better job this cycle. So I think that I agree, there's a ton of room for improvement in Working Group 1, and I hope that we'll start to see some of that happen. At the scoping meeting for Working Group 1, there were Indigenous participants, plural, in the room. And I think that you see that reflected in the Working Group 1 outline itself now, making specific mention to Indigenous knowledge systems. So yeah, I hope that there are Indigenous scholars who apply, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge holders who apply to be an author or a lead author, a coordinating lead author in Working Group 1. What I'm going to do, there's one quick technical question in the chat about the national focal points have very different views, often very negative about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ecological knowledge. If you're from one of those countries and you're unable to be nominated by your country, please feel free to reach out to a bureau member. My email address is in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. I can nominate you for the process. Now what I'd like to do is take 3 interventions or 3 questions, and then turn it to the panel so we can get through as many questions as possible. So I see Dawn, your hand is up. I'd like to turn the floor over to you. Are you unable to mute to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Great, thank you. I just really appreciate this opportunity. I've wondered how one engages with the IPCC. I quote quite a bit in my research. As a Haudenosaunee person, I really like the point that was raised. We are not a homogeneous group around the world. I just published an article about Haudenosaunee sovereignty and our ability to access these spaces becomes highly problematic when we're not attached to a national organization such as the AFN. We have a traditional government and we have an elected government. So gender becomes really relevant in terms of myself and many other scholars who I work with who are embedded in our communities, who do research with and by our communities, tend to be the ones that are locked out of this very international UN dialogue that's happening. And I think I can't imagine, since we're very urban at Six Nations, how other more northerly communities I've also worked with, or I've worked in the Amazon as well with elders from there, how on earth are they going to have access when there's no pathway, no process established that's truly equitable to those of us that are not engaged in the political scene of Canada or nation colonial states, but representing our people? How would elders, that's who I've worked with for 30 years, knowledge holders, this is not a space they would feel comfortable in. So I'm just trying to imagine, these are good recommendations, and I love the work you did, both Rosario and Dr. Sherpa, in analyzing the work of the IPCC. It's a very important process. I understand that, but I also understand there's barriers upon barriers for our ability to truly engage, not as an Indigenous homogeneous intellectual group with the same experiences, but a very diverse histories and realities and languages. What pathway is being established? And is this it? Or is there a committee that could maybe establish that pathway and that protocol that could ethically engage? Is that work being done, or is this it? This process here that came through my university, not through my community. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Surinder, we can turn it over to you if you're unable to mute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. It has been a wonderful experience listening to learned speakers, Pasang, Rosario, Reed, and yourself also, and Dr. Chakravarti. I am basically a chartered accountant with an experience of almost now 45 years. I've been working in financial and non-financial reporting assurances now for the past 43 years. I have worked in the climate and ESG thing now for the past 10 years. I've had a training on SDGs from the headquarters, New York also. And then I've been engaged for the past almost 7-8 years in the standard setting with GRI, TCFD, IFRS, S1, S2. I'm also on the board of Sustainability Board of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and other chambers of commerce in India and leading chambers of commerce in India. I've been contributing for the standard settings and working on these climate change as well as on reporting assurances. I even submitted my submissions to UNFCCC as well as to UNICTAD. I've attended a couple of seminars. I've been one of the speakers also in COP28 on climate finance. So, but I have been applying for this AR7 now for the past 1 year. It has been coming up quite often after one or the other. This is the 3rd time I've submitted. And now, what is the procedure? I have now, I'm really thankful to you that you have shared an email. I can send it to you directly. I really want to contribute now at the fag end of my career, which I have my experience and knowledge almost for now 45 years, I want to contribute in this to IPCC. My work with the UNFCCC and UNICTAD has been really appreciated. I went to Geneva last year and spoke on, we have worked on uniform accounting systems with the UNICTAD on ISAR, and then on climate finance with UNFCCC. So all those things I want to contribute here also, but maybe I'll take some chance to work with the GST also. I don't know. If you can help me, I can write an email to you, please.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read out two questions from the chat, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists. Okay, has the IPCC set a threshold for fair representation in the selection of reviewers' authors as a means to ensure fair representation of Indigenous peoples? And another question, how does the IPCC define Indigenous or Indigenous peoples? And how does the IPCC plan to reach out to different language groups within how it works? So I'd like to, and I also just want to make a quick comment that any questions that aren't answered during this session, fear not, we're going to compile all those questions and circulate answers to them by email after the session. Pisang, Dr. Sherpa, over to you.
Thank you, Sherry. I really want to recognize what Dawn mentioned. And for me, if there's one thing to take away from the study of AR6, that is that on the one hand, IPCC needs to recognize that all Indigenous peoples are not the same. The only thing that all Indigenous person around the world will agree is that we are not the same. The other thing is also, I think now that we're talking about the selection of authors and reviewers and such by the IPCC, I wonder if there is a criteria in place. I also want to echo the question, but then kind of point out that when we're thinking about Indigenous peoples or Indigenous scholars participation, sometimes the tendency is to divide Indigenous scholars based on colonial boundaries. And I think that needs to be really recognized. And so one thing that I wanted to highlight, thinking back to my presentation earlier, was that, and this is based on the study, right? So just thinking about Indigenous scholars from the global North or the global South context, like using that framework is a way to divide Indigenous scholars and Indigenous authors based on colonial borders. But if we're really thinking about equitable and meaningful engagement of Indigenous peoples and knowledges, I think it's very important to recognize that there are a lot of Indigenous authors who are doing work and who do not really, the colonial borders should not be recognized in that sense. So, so just the fact that it was the North America chapter that really spoke directly to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous issues, that should be an example. But that's also, like this time around, I'm not so confident that North America chapter will be doing the same. So what are the other ones that are going to do that? So that's what one thing, if there's to take away from AR6, is that.
Thank you, Pisang. Any other panelists or speakers like to respond to any of the questions? Rosa, Dr. Kamarna, it looks like you're going to unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add something to the first question, and I believe that Indigenous authors and knowledge holders can also contribute to ask different questions and also help to reframe the problem, and if possible to contribute to the scoping of the chapters, if that is possible. And also highlight Indigenous-led research, because I really miss that in the last cycle, and collaborations, partnerships between different knowledge systems. I wanted to add something and now I forgot, I'm sorry. Yes, I wanted to mention something from my experience, and I don't know if this is correct. Sherry, you can correct me. But as a contributing author, I have contributed also to IPES, and I always had this feeling that my collaboration was rather superficial, and I wanted to engage more. I know that CLAs and LAs have a lot of work and they manage a lot of big teams, but I wonder if contributing authors can also, if people can reach out to CLAs and LAs and offer support as a contributing authors, because nevertheless, it's really key that IPCC has more Indigenous CLAs and LAs. I think also contributing authors can play a role, specifically contributing to these differences and bringing experience from different peoples and noting these different nationalities, cultures, and diversity. So I wonder if it's possible if contributing authors can reach out to CLAs and LAs and offer support as a contributing authors and keep insistent and how their contributions are addressed and incorporated into the reports, because sometimes you send the contribution as a contributing author and you never heard back until the report is published, and you feel like, oh, but I wanted to, this was not taken correctly, or my contribution was not addressed as I thought. So yeah, I think being a contributing author can also be a way to influence the process.
Yeah, being a contributing author is really, really critical. And I think the experience can vary. It depends who the lead author is that you're working with. And so, yeah, that really depends. And that's also why it's really important to have Indigenous peoples be lead authors themselves to manage that process in an ethical, meaningful way, so that experience that you just described doesn't happen, because obviously that's not acceptable. Kata, and then Graham, over to you.
I really appreciated everyone's comments and from the panelists and the questions. I just wanted to highlight again to the room that although the process for being nominated and selected as authors is very challenging and complicated, I also wanted to highlight that having accredited observer organizations from Indigenous peoples organizations is incredibly beneficial in determining what happens with the final text, because with the best participation in the drafting of the text, the changes that can still happen at the level of the approval of the text by all of the member states, by all of the accredited observer organizations, can still be a significant influence on the process. And so, as Graham pointed out in his comments, having even Indigenous peoples organizations that are already accredited through the UNFCCC process participate within the IPCC process is a relatively straightforward accreditation, but then participating in the space, being present in the room, commenting on how Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights, and Indigenous knowledges are then reflected in those final copies of the text is a very important space to shift and shape the way that the process works. And so just wanted to highlight that again, that although the process is still reflective of the system where there is a preference for these larger representative bodies, it makes still a meaningful influence, and also to be present throughout the entirety of the cycle, from the scoping, drafting to the approval.
Thanks, Kata. Graham.
Yeah, I mean, Miigwech, for all of the important questions, and Dawn in particular, I think is a really important reflection, not only with respect to how do we avoid the homogenization of Indigenous peoples, but also just how are we developing institutional pathways. And there were a couple comments in the chat that talked about, like, what is the exact selection criteria, who chooses, how does that process occur? And that's largely not done by observer organizations. And so even observer organizations who can nominate authors, the process of selecting authors is done by the Bureau, done by co-chairs and vice chairs, et cetera. And so there's even that measure of like distance from who and how folks are being represented within the actual selection process. And so I think if we don't do it through this process, then I think we've lost another 7 years of work until the institutional changes. And so in absence of that, like how are we leveraging things like this expert meeting to invoke the more institutional change, which is how are Indigenous peoples and all of that their diversity included within not only the actual production of reports, how are knowledge holders, elders, et cetera, included within, but also within the governance of those processes. So who's selecting people? How are we ensuring that the selection of authors doesn't actually perpetuate, knowledge hierarchy and epistemic violence? How do we make sure that we're also talking about the usability of reports? Like, how are these reports actually being useful for Indigenous peoples on the grounds, or are they? And so then for me, the question becomes like, what are the ways in which we understand this process as what it is, which is for many Indigenous peoples, a harm reduction mechanism, right? How are we reducing the harm that these reports are causing, whether on a knowledge basis or whether on a justification of mitigation or adapt solutions imposed on their lands, waters, and territories? And then alternatively, what do Indigenous-led processes of assessment, articulation, and communication look like? And how are we creating those coalitions of Indigenous peoples in a way that really prevents the kind of disciplinary silos that we see within the UNFCCC? Like all of the work that for instance, Don, you've done and other Indigenous scholars have done, often from a contributing lead author perspective, don't feel relevant to their specific disciplinary focus. And that again is actually perpetuating these problems of, whose knowledge and how is being considered. And so how do we unpack all of those different elements? Sorry.
No, thank you so much, Graham. And so I'm just acknowledging that there are some questions that have been unanswered in the chat. I saw some people raise their virtual hand. We're not going to be able to get to those in the session today. If you had your hand raised, please include your question, type it out in the Q&A, and then that way we'll make sure to respond to it after the session closes. I just also want to acknowledge that some people had submitted questions in advance of the session that we haven't had a chance to speak to. We'll also answer those and circulate those Q&As after the session. I acknowledge that we're at the end of our time, but I do want to turn the floor over to Ramon and Pasang really quickly. So Ramon, the floor is yours, and then Pasang, you can close us off today.
Thank you very much, Shirley. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, the invitation to be here with you in this discussion. I would say that it is taking place in a very crucial momentum during the AR7 preparation, as we are within the process. The process for nominating lead author is still open, and it's very important to have a good representation of the Indigenous peoples in this contest. I would say the presentation has been extremely interesting, and I would like to add that in addition to this nomination process, there is in preparation a workshop dealing with Indigenous knowledge. The diverse forms of knowledge, including, of course, the Indigenous knowledge, and this is another aspect that we need to take into account. This has been already approved, having a workshop on this topic, which is crucial. What has been said in terms of the process, in my view, is very, very, very important. Not only the nomination and the selection process that is carried out by the working group bureaus, and then with the endorsement of the whole bureau, I could say that there are another areas that we need to take into account in the process. In my view, the role of the observer organization is crucial, as in complementing, for instance, not only the nomination process, but the whole following of the process in the context of the IPCC. And in that sense, I would encourage more observer organization from the Indigenous peoples to be actively involved with the IPCC. Of course, there is another issue, the issue of the contributing authors that has been already mentioned. Of course, they can self contribute in connection to the chapter teams, but also they can try to contact the bureau members of their respective regions in trying to get in support, as you mentioned, for not only for nominating, but also during the process for contributing, in the case of contributing author, to support those those initiatives. And I would like to also strongly support the idea of in complementing what has been already said, necessarily the IPCC and the current leadership of the IPCC has the commitment to improve and increase diversity and inclusion as part of this mandate. And there are many recommendations here, not only the message from the AR6, but also new recommendation for AR7. But in addition to all of those recommendations, I would like to highlight what has been already said in terms of the bottom-up approach as part of the process. What has been, for instance, said with regard to the national report and the inclusion of chapters and a specific content in the national report, and why not also report from indigenous and indigenous knowledge holders that can be complementing the production by the IPCC, can be at the same time information that can be used during the assessment to complement the key message in the IPCC that necessarily in many cases is written in a very global kind of perspective, and it is not only true for the indigenous people, but also for other sub-regions, for the southern regions and the many developing countries sub-regions that are underrepresented in the whole report. So as much as we have a bottom-up approach in producing, let's say, parallel report that can supplement information for the assessment as part of the expert. It could be also part of the proceeding of expert meetings or workshops and so on that can be intentionally produced to contribute to the whole process. In my view, could be much more important for capturing this diversity that has been already mentioned, and in my view is crucial in the report. I also I support the idea that working group 2 has been the working group that has been the leader in taking care of the concerns, priorities, and key messages out of the indigenous peoples with regard to climate change science and with regard to the responses to climate change, and also the use of the literature. They have been also leaders in the using literature in some cases, the so-called non-peer review literature, but relevant for the assessment. And these are areas taken from the working group 2 that could be much more generalized and used during this assessment. But again, the connection with the Bureau is crucial, not only for this nominating process. Please try to use the observer organization and also the Bureau member that can support your nomination. In fact, lead authors are the cornerstone of the assessment report of the IPCC. Being a lead author, you are in a position to contribute to the writing team, to contributing in accepting contributing authors, and to properly influence in the process. So not let pass this opportunity when the call for nomination is still open till the 17th of this month, to try to have this nomination, to have your nominations and to have nominated those indigenous knowledge holders that could improve the process. Necessarily, this is a gradual process. And I will need to try to influence as much as possible at this during this early stage of the preparation, to try to have a better balance process at the end that I would hope would be the case. Thank you again for the invitation, and sorry for taking too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Ramon. Pesahing, I'm really happy to turn it over to you to give us a last word.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sherpa, over
I'll
to you.
make this 1 minute, so I'll try to do this in 1 minute. For the last part of my comment, I want to think again about the words that Dawn has shared with us today, and make 3 very specific comments, and also thinking alongside our panelists. One is the fact that IPCC should not be the only climate assessment in the room, right? So it should be in conversation with other Indigenous climate assessments. And so that is my first point. And how do we support that? And how do we recognize them as these different other reports as important sources? The second is we talked a little bit about the selection of the authors, but then also recognizing that, the qualification criteria to be a lead author is such that it already limits so many people. And so only very few people are qualified. But then once you get nominated and selected, like who actually has the time, energy, and resource to participate in the IPCC meaningfully? I think that's another key point. And if we're thinking about Indigenous authors, like the nomination and selection and criteria, like all of those things are great. Like those are already, well, first of all, those are already problematic and discouraging for Indigenous authors. It reduces the pool. And even after that, like when you're participating in the IPCC processes, like not all Indigenous authors or the people who are qualified actually do not have the resources to engage with. So I think this now goes directly, my comment is directly to the IPCC. How are you going to ensure what Graham said earlier, the institutional pathways to ensure that Indigenous authors are supported, Indigenous lead authors are compensated or supported? Because like if we have Indigenous authors, especially junior professionals, academics, like we cannot ask them to sacrifice their pre-tenure years or their job search years to being a lead author. Is just not a good thing. Like we cannot do that. And then once you're already lead author in that role, again, thinking back to what Dawn has shared, like where's the gender participation and what does that look like? And I think similarly, there are other issues that need to be reflected on and acted upon. And so one of the things that got Rithodi and I started from the very beginning was the fact that we were reflecting on our experiences as contributing authors, and Rithodi being a man, non-Indigenous, somebody who's, well, tall, but recognizing all of those features really, how his experience was so different from mine. And mine, similar to what Rosa shared earlier, I actually felt like it was more of a tokenistic inclusion of somebody with an Indigenous name, a recognizably Indigenous name. And so those issues I also want to emphasize as I end this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And, I have to say, as an IPCC Bureau member, I completely agree and acknowledge that we have a long, long way to go and a ton of room for improvement. And, I think that we need to work on that. And I also want to welcome all of you to join us in that journey to try and work towards those improvements. I think that all of the points that were made today are very well taken and very important points. So I just wanted to acknowledge those. So a huge thank you to everyone who participated today. A special thank you to all the presenters and panelists who you see on the screen here, as well as the team working behind the scenes to make this webinar work. I especially wanted to thank the IPCC observer organizations, the Inuit Circumpolar Council and Assembly of First Nations, for co-hosting this session with IPCC today. Thank you to all of you on the call who raised really important points and questions. Again, a reminder, we're going to answer all of the questions that weren't answered live in a Q&A document that will be circulated after. The links to the application process, including how to find your focal point, how to find the list of Indigenous or different observer organizations, as well as the application materials to apply to be a coordinating lead author or review editor, can be found in the chat, as well as my email address if you are an Indigenous person and would not like to apply through your government or don't have access to an observer organization. I'd be happy to nominate you. We're also going to share a recording of this session, so if you want to share it with others who missed it, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your interest in the IPCC. Bye for now.